when I talk about my voice and being uncomfortable with that, it kind of ties into as well with something that trans people in particular, and in the broader LGBTQ community, we grow up with shame as our constant partner. Uh, because when I grew up, I'm old, I'll be 62 on Tuesday. So I was born in 1958, and it was an interesting time to be alive because our phones were bolted to the wall and had, the little rotary dials and things like that. So if I wanted to find out why I felt like the way I felt like, I couldn't just pick up my phone and just go, why do I feel this way? And find instant communities that would tell me what I felt and who I was. So as a little kid, the only thing that I could think of that would describe me was freak. And it's an ugly word, but I couldn't think of anything else that would apply to that because none of my friends felt the way I felt. There was no TV shows, there was no movie role models, there were no transgender actors or actresses. Matter of fact, the word transgender wasn't coined until about 1972, and I was 14 by then. So I never even thought the possibility existed that I could transition and live the life that I felt that I was. And it's like, if you think back, people sometimes, say, well, why would you choose to be transgender? I wouldn't. That's the last thing in the world. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. And I think that if you're going to survive as someone who is transgender, if you have a good sense of humor, it'll help you along because there's a lot that you just kind of shake your head at. But if you think about when you were growing up and you were 5 or 6 years old, did you need an adult to tell you that you were a boy or a girl? Chances are you didn't. You knew. But for me, I knew, and the adults were wrong. And it doesn't happen very often. We represented about 0.7% of the population. But gender lives up here, sex lives down there. And those two things, in most cases, are congruent, but when it's not, you end up with somebody like me. So as we go along, I've got a slide deck that I'll play for you, and it'll kind of go along, and we'll narrate through it. But if you would just keep this physical image, because that's going to go away. And so if you'd please do me a favor and not picture a favorite uncle, that would help me a lot. So we'll punch up the screen. There we go. We should all see that.
Also, just a note that this is being recorded.
Sure.
So people have missed it, they can tune on to it again.
So there you go. I'm on the right there. That's me out at the state capitol on lobby day. So we go out and we visit a lot of representatives in the state capitol, and we try and get things changed through that, just as part of kind of what I do. So Resource Center has been around for 37 years now. It's not the new kid on the block. It started out as a foundation for human understanding. And shortly after it was founded came the AIDS epidemic. And so we kind of swung into action, helping those living with HIV and AIDS. We still have a food pantry, which was the very first thing that we started doing, is giving out food to low-income LGBT members that were HIV positive. That still exists today. We also have a hot meals program. We have a primary care clinic. We do a free testing. We have a testing clinic, which is free on Cedar Springs. We have the health campus where we have case management. And we have a whole lot of different things. We have a youth program called Youth First. And we also have one called Thrive for people that are over 50, because having the social interaction is so important. And that's had to kind of morph as everything else has with the pandemic that we've been dealing with. Okay. At the end of the training, hopefully, if I do my job, we'll provide some basic terminology associated with the community, explore steps associated with the coming out process, and provide a foundation for cultural competency, really kind of a light touch on LGBTQ issues, because to do a full deep dive onto that would take a presentation in and of itself. We'll also talk about some of the roles that phobias and isms have and how they can affect cultural competency. And then we'll wind up with some calls to action to become better LGBTQ allies and champions. If you have questions along the way, please let Sherry know, and she'll pass them along to me. And we'll address them as we go, because I don't want to go too far along the line if there's some issue that we're dealing with here that we want to get a little bit more knowledge on. So please don't be shy, because questions are wonderful.
put your questions in the chat if you have any.
Yeah. So hopefully you're familiar with the letters LGBTQ, and those are really just for starters, but it is for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer questioning. And they can be GLBTQ, as it would have been maybe 10 years ago, but as long as all the letters are there, that's what matters the most. Sexual orientation. It's a person's enduring physical, romantic, emotional, and spiritual attraction to another person. Everybody has a sexual orientation. When you're dealing with transgender people, though, it starts to get a little bit weird, because I was married. I have 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. They live in Atlanta, and I get to see them from time to time, not nearly as much as I would like. So when I look at labels as far as sexual orientation as apply to me, I've always been attracted to women, and that's never changed. I identified, well, I had the identity put upon me that I was a white male, and I did the things as best I could, knowing who I felt internally, but I lived the life that society wanted me to live. I didn't see any other option. Like I said, growing up, there just wasn't those other kind of role models. And so, by definition, I guess externally, I would have been a heterosexual male, right? So I'm transgendered, and I suddenly one morning wake up as a lesbian. And so whatever label you want to hang on me, I'll take. I don't really use labels myself. I just live my life, but I'm married to a woman who is also transgender like myself and identifies as female, and I see her as nothing but female. And so that attraction still remains. So I'm in a same-sex marriage, so it certainly puts me at a couple of spots on the LGBTQ spectrum, the L and the T. But I just find it curious that, you know, society would identify me as 2 different things depending on how they look at me, and I've always felt the same. So that's, it's just part of the, like I said, you need a sense of humor to be transgender. For bisexual people, this is where a lot of people kind of stub their toe on bisexual people. Someone who's physically or romantically or emotionally attracted to 2 genders. Bisexuals need not have had sexual experience with both men and women. In fact, they don't have to have any sexual experience at all to identify as bisexual. Now, when I say 2 genders, you might think automatically, well, that's men and women. Well, there can be non-binary people, right? So someone might be attracted to women and non-binary people. Those are 2 genders. So that's someone who's bisexual. Also, for some of my friends who are bisexual, if you have a woman who is with another woman, they say, oh, so you're a lesbian now. Nope, still bisexual. It has to do not with who you're with at the moment, it has to do with who you're attracted to. So if you might look and say, that woman is really attractive to me, but so is this non-binary person, or so is this guy, but I'm still with my wife, I'm still monogamous, but I'm bisexual because I would be attracted to more than one gender. I hope that makes sense. Heterosexual. I don't know that I need to spend a whole lot of time describing that, but it describes the vast majority of people on Earth is someone who's enduring physical or romantic or emotional attraction is to people of the opposite sex. And it's even kind of strange to say the word opposite because we're closer to being the same than, you know, diametrically opposed, but it's kind of the accepted terminology. For someone who's asexual, it's someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction or doesn't experience sexual attraction that's more common. It might be a little bit less, or it might be a lot less. The little pride flag that you see in the upper right is the asexual pride flag, and we'll have some more of these as we go along. But part of the terminology is ace, which is kind of a shorthand for asexual, an umbrella term for people that identify in the asexual spectrum might be demisexual, which is kind of me, because demisexual is someone who, I'm not into one-night stands. I'm not a love at first sight kind of girl. I'm more of, if you're my best friend, then I start to see things I'm attracted to. I would much rather have a relationship with somebody before there would ever be the physical attraction. And so that's someone who's demisexual. Gray or gray ace is also kind of describing on that spectrum where they're not completely asexual, where they're not attracted at all, but maybe just kind of minimal. So that would be gray. Gender identity, again, that's the sex with which you identify. So everyone has a gender identity. It's interesting when we use the term like sexual orientation or gender identity, people immediately jump to, oh, you mean gay or lesbian, or oh, you mean transgender, if I'm talking gender identity. But everybody on the call today has one. In most people, though, the gender identity matches biological sex. When it doesn't, the umbrella term that we use is transgender. And like I said, we make up maybe 0.7 to 1.4% of the population. That's an estimate. So I don't say that people that are not transgender are normal. They're just common, right? So we're kind of uncommon, but I wouldn't say we're abnormal because I'm perfectly happy with who I am. And there's never been a doubt about that. It's always been fixed. I've only 10 years ago been able to kind of act on it and be who I am. And I've never been happier. I've never been more well-adjusted. It has kind of been the fulfillment of how I felt even as a little kid. It's interesting too, I'll share a story with you because my name, Leslie, is obviously not the name I was born with. And I was born in 1958, and that was before sonograms. And sonograms allowed parents to identify the sex of the child that was being born, right? So that way, if they knew that they were going to have a boy, they'd start going through the list of boy names. And if they knew they were having a girl, they'd go through the list of girl names. But prior to that, when I was born, it was common for parents to pick a boy name and a girl name so that whenever the baby was born, they knew what name to put on the birth certificate. And so I remember I was about 5 years old, and I grew up in Southern California. And my mom was ironing, which I don't think people do too much anymore, but she used to do it a lot. So she was ironing, and I was sitting on the floor watching her. And I asked my mom kind of out of the blue, because I've been mulling it over, and I said, because I knew who I was. I said, Mom, if I was born a girl, what was my girl name going to be? And she said, we were going to name you Leslie. And I said, I like that name. And I didn't know how to further the conversation because, again, I was 5 and the vocabulary didn't exist to explain how I felt and who I was. Doctors would not have been affirming at all. I'd have probably been institutionalized if I'd have pushed the issue. But I did the best I could. But I love that name. And it's been near and dear to me. And I used to practice writing it as a signature. And then I'd wad it up and I'd throw it away because I didn't want anybody seeing it. Because I don't want to answer those questions. Because like I said, shame kind of follows you along, right? When you're a little kid, because there's a lot of expectations when you have a male child or a female child. There's the societal expectations that are put on that kid. And so I did the best I could with it. But as soon as I could change it legally, I did. And that was in Travis County. And there was a judge there named Robin Hurley. And it was in her chambers. And she said to me, I've read your petition and I'm going to grant your request. And your name is now Leslie Michelle McMurray. And all I could blurt out was, thank you for changing my life. And I just started bawling there at her table because it meant so much to me to have that name that I'd wanted for so long. So it is really important to us. But yeah, gender identity is who you identify as, right? And so my gender identity is as clear and fixed as anyone on this call. There's no confusion about who I am. It's just my body betrayed who I knew to be up here. And it's not something that's mental. It's something that's biological. It has causes that we don't know exactly what they are yet. If you're old enough and you happen to remember, there was a drug called DES. And it was banned back in the 70s, but DES was commonly taken by women with high-risk pregnancies. And my mom was 39 with me, and I was born in 1958. I was her first pregnancy. So that was considered high risk. They gave my mom DES, and it's a real powerful synthetic estrogen. And so there's some conjecture that has a cause, having the embryo exposed to that much estrogen. I don't know. but it's just a thought. I know it's not the only cause because DES has been banned for probably 3 decades, but who knows? There's a lot of DES babies, and the commonalities they find are being left-handed and being transgender, and I'm both of those. So someone whose identification as male or female differs from the sex assigned at birth. In most people, the gender identity matches. Some of the shorthand you'll see is MTF or FTM. That's mostly found on things like message boards or possibly in the medical community as just a shorthand. It's not something that's used colloquially, so I don't think you'd want to refer to somebody as an MTF or an FTM. Certainly not to their face, and again, it's just an abbreviation. So to clarify being transgender, gender identity is different from sexual orientation. They're like tires and peaches. They're just not the same thing. They're completely different from one another, and they can, they're independent from one another. So identification is the key for a transgender person. Surgery is not the determining factor. And I can illustrate that, again, just think to yourself that if someone had done gender reassignment surgery on you, you would still identify the same. It wouldn't change how you identify up here. It would change what the anatomy looks like down there. So if you were different down there, you'd still feel the same up here. You would just feel like there's something wrong now because there is a dissonance. Your human body does not look back in the mirror like you feel up here, and it's a very disconcerting feeling. So outward appearance may or may not be helpful in determining how someone identifies. So what do we do then? We've got non-binary people, people that don't identify as either male or female, and they may dress in a way that might be puzzling to you. It might be to where it's not obvious from their haircut or the way they carry themselves or the clothes that they're wearing. And so those may be non-binary. So if there's uncertainty, just respectfully ask which pronouns to use. And pronouns to us are very, very important. And we'll talk about some of these things as we go along. But like I said, misgendering can potentially put somebody who's transgender in physical harm's way. So definitely that. But it can also be affirming to someone. If you affirm my pronouns, I feel safe talking to you. If you don't, I don't. So it's okay to ask. You're not going to offend me if you ask what my pronouns are, but if you do, and I tell you what they are, please use them. And I go by she, her, hoping, obviously. A person's gender identity is considered protected medical information under HIPAA. So again, it's even if you saw me in like a Starbucks and you didn't mean anything by it, but I was, getting coffee up there and you said, hey, there's that transgender woman that did that training for us. Someone who really, really, really hates transgender people may then follow me out to my car and do horrible things. And it does happen. So outing someone in public or giving away that information can not just violate HIPAA, but it can also put somebody in harm's way. I'm hoping that y'all don't want to do that. The term transgender is an adjective, it's not a noun. And even some well-meaning people will say, oh, there's that transgendered girl. I'm not transgendered, I'm not a transgender, I'm a transgender woman. So it's an adjective, it's a descriptor, it's not a noun. And that's real important. Trans men are men, trans women are women. There's not really a qualifier on that. Outside of trainings like this, Katie and I live our lives as women. We don't live our lives as transgender women. I don't have a t-shirt that says, kiss me, I'm transgender, when I go to the grocery store. We just go to the store and we live our lives as women, and we move about as women, and we act and live as women. We're just a little bit on the taller side. I'm almost 6 feet. Katie is about an inch over, and so they refer to us as the tall girls at the store. So I think that's cute. Some of the other variants you'll see are trans-masculine or trans-feminine, masculine of center. And we'll get into some of the non-binary issues in a couple. But I admire and respect non-binary people so much because, as I was mentioning before, when you have a baby that's born, and I think it was even more so growing up when I did in the 1960s, but if you had a good example is a friend of mine, a guy named Randy that I used to do radio with. he had a son named Colby, and he wanted me to come see Colby. And I said, okay. So I went over, and here's this like 6.5-pound baby boy. He's in his bassinet, little tiny thing wrapped in a blanket. And next to him was a full-size NFL football. And I thought, what's the deal with a football, Randy? And he says, oh, I just want him to get used to it, because I want him to play football. And his little itty bitty hands, he couldn't hold a football. I mean, he didn't even know what it was, probably couldn't see it. And I thought, that's kind of a awful thing. I mean, if Colby wants to play football, great, encourage that, fan those flames, and help him be the best he can. But if he grows up and he's an architect, is he going to be a failure to you? Because as a parent, to me, and I've raised 2 daughters and I've got 5 grandkids, and I often write in their birthday cards, dream big dreams, because I want kids to fulfill what their dreams are. And that's our job as parents, is to help our kids live their best life. It's not to help those kids live our failed dreams. If Randy wasn't a great football player, it's like, well, I got a second chance here with Colby. No, help Colby live his life. Maybe he wants to play tennis or baseball or chess, but whatever it is, help him be the best he can at that, rather than inflicting those things. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg, because you expect guys to stand their ground and be tough and not show emotion and be good breadwinners and fathers and all these things we expect guys to be. And on the other side, same thing with women. They're supposed to be, more emotional and more compassionate, be good wives, and be subservient to men. And a lot of that's even taught in religion. And so there's all these expectations. So for non-binary people, they're saying, this extreme end over here, that's not me. I'm not a girly girl at all. But I'm not that, kind of toxic masculinity, tough guy male. So neither this or this applies to me. But I'm going to take some of the best of these things and some of the best of these things, and I'm going to meet kind of somewhere in the middle, and this amalgam is who I am. That's pretty cool. But that takes a lot of courage, because I was talking to a non-binary friend of mine, and they said, yeah, I just don't go out with friends much because the bathroom options are, I might be assaulted, or if I go in this one, they're going to call the police or get questioned. And so really neither bathroom appeals, and most bars and restaurants don't have family bathrooms where they can just go in and just be themselves. So it really does take a tremendous amount of courage to live a non-binary life in a binary society, because our society, make no mistake, is very, very binary. We just recognize 2 genders, right? Male and female. Gender non-binary or gender diverse people is a term that we use to describe genders that don't fall into one of these 2 categories of male or female. Over at the Genesis Center, which is out of Children's Hospital, they refer to it as gender creative. And they just kind of help kids find their niche there. You don't have to understand what it means for someone to be non-binary to respect them. Being respectful to a non-binary person includes using the correct name and pronouns. Many times they, them are the pronouns that you use. And let me talk about they, them for a second, because it's really, really common, especially among older people or people that may have an English degree, to say, well, they, them is a plural pronoun. No, it's not. It's a conditionally plural pronoun. We use it as a single pronoun all the time, but we don't think about it. Because if I said, hey, I went to Tom Thumb yesterday and I got too much change back, you'd say, well, how much did they give you? Because I didn't identify the gender of the checker, right? So I didn't identify the gender, so we automatically and smoothly insert they or them to it as a singular pronoun. We've done it our whole lives. So if somebody says my pronouns are they, them, just go ahead and use that. And just imagine the checker experience of, I didn't identify the gender, so they use they, them, and it's a singular pronoun. So it's really, really important to us. Pronouns really do matter. And so the question comes then is, what do you do if you slip up? The easiest way is just correct it and move on. It's not something that I'm going to take with me if I get misgendered. Again, like drive-throughs and things like that. If it's somebody that I'm going to have an ongoing relationship with, like I called a contractor to do some work over at the house, and the first time they said, sir, I just corrected them. And because it's somebody that I'm going to have to see again and again and again. But if it's somebody that I'm just like ordering a pizza or something and they say, thank you, sir, and it's like, yeah, great, you can hang up and move on. So if you misgender somebody accidentally, just correct it and move on. Here's what happens when you don't. I was in Atlanta a couple of years ago. I guess maybe it's like 4 or 5 years by now. But my family, my kids live in Atlanta. And so Thanksgiving dinner was at my in-laws. And so Debbie, my sister-in-law, was in there cooking, and they'd taken all the chairs from around the table and brought them into the living room. And because they have a big family. And so there's like 15, 18 chairs, and they had a fire going, and there was a football game on, and people were all talking, just, typical Thanksgiving. And so when the food was ready, there was no chairs around the table. So Debbie comes in, and Katie and I happen to be sitting closest to the kitchen entrance. So she just turned to us and she goes, hey, would you guys grab the chairs and bring them back around the table because we're about ready to serve dinner? I said, sure, Deb, no problem. And she takes like 2 steps and she comes back and goes, oh my God, I am so sorry. I said you guys, but I didn't mean you guys like you guys are guys. I just say you guys a lot. And I don't mean anything by it. Like, and it's like, Debbie, it's all right. It's okay. Move on. So she made a big deal over it when it wasn't a big deal. Because we understand colloquial terms. You say you guys, you're not going to bother me at all. I understand. That's great. Now, if you say, hey, dudes, then I might have a problem with it. But just simple things like you guys doesn't bother us. If you think it does, then just say, oh, I'm sorry. I meant ladies. Okay, great. Thanks, Deb. Move on. But to make a big deal over it, you don't really need to overemphasize it. Just fix it and move on. Some of the other things that you'll see, gender queer, it's another catch-all for gender identities that fall outside the binary. Pangender, gender fluid, non-gendered, agender. We're talking some real gender minorities here, and it's not something that you really need to memorize so much. And really what the whole point of this is so that you're not walking on eggshells. We don't want you to walk on eggshells around us. We are not so wound up politically correct that, any little transgression is a big deal. It's not. And again, if you foul it up, just fix it, move on, or just take it as a kind of a teachable moment and say, tell me more about that. What is pangender? How does that, apply to you? Because pangender, having the Latin root meaning all, it just basically says I don't fall into one gender pod. I may represent more than one, and that's just how I express my life. Because gender is something that for most people, they don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about it. I would imagine for most of you, when you get up in the morning, your gender is not the first thing you think about. For many years, it was not just the first thing, but it was something that was kind of a constant irritant because I was forced to live in something that I just didn't feel comfortable with and trying to interact with the world that way. So people tend to expect you to be consistent within that presentation. So for me, if I felt like wearing a dress one day to my radio station job, I would have been ridiculed up one side and down the other because that's not what people do if it's not Halloween or something. So now I can dress however I want. I have the freedom to do pretty much anything. But for someone who's pangender, it might be more difficult for them to live their life in a way that reflects one gender one day and one gender the next. And people are going to say, hey, wait a minute, what's the deal with you? And so if they want to take the time to help educate you, that's great, but they certainly don't owe it to you. Gender fluid is kind of a different version of that. Gender fluid meaning that you might identify a little more male one day, a little more female the next, and I think that's fine as well. Because if like you have a hobby of playing golf, it doesn't mean that's all you do. That just means that's one of your hobbies. Non-gendered is someone who really doesn't identify by any particular gender, or agender is kind of the same sort of thing. And again, we're talking minorities, because when we talk about being transgender, the whole umbrella covers 0.7 to 1.4, and these are little tiny slivers of that 0.7. So there's not a whole lot of folks running around identifying as agender, but some do. Mostly it's youth, because they have been able to be raised in a fairly recent environment where gender exploration is a little bit more tolerated. The term transgender versus transsexual. Transsexual used to identify who'd had surgery. And like I said before, surgery is not the determining factor in someone who's transgender. There's not a case of, oh, you're not transgender enough because you haven't had da-da-da-da. Also, there's no the surgery. That's not a question you want to ask someone who's transgender because A, it's irrelevant, B, it's none of your business, and C, there's not the surgery. If someone asks me that question, and they have, I know what you're getting at. I know what you mean, but there are a whole slew of surgeries that a transgender person might have. It took me 2 years just to get the facial hair to quit growing. And I'm talking 2 years of electrolysis, which if you've ever had it is really painful. It hurts a lot. And that's going every 6 weeks for about 8 hours at a time. So it's insanely painful, it's time consuming, it's embarrassing, and it costs about as much as a Hyundai. And it's not covered by insurance. So it's not fun. That's one of those things where people go, why would you choose that? Well, I wouldn't, no one would, that's crazy. But if that's who you are, someone once described to me, they said, oh, you're so courageous. Well, to me, it's courageous, kind of like the courage it takes to jump out of a burning house, right? If you stay inside, you're going to burn to death. So let's take our chances jumping out of it because you might survive the fall. And fortunately, yay, I survived the fall, but I wasn't going to stay inside that burning house because there was no future in that. So yeah, so if that's courage, then yeah, we'll go by that. So to sum up, sexual orientation is who you go to bed with. Gender identity is who you go to bed as. It has to do with identity versus attraction. That's a really easy way to kind of remember that. Before we move on, is there any other questions? Everybody good?
There are some questions in the chat. And again, you might want to deal with these later. A few of them were about what does binary mean, and you answered those. One is, the question is, to what extent has the Christian view on LGBTQ, in particular the Catholic dogma, been a destructive and devastating barrier for LGBTQ acceptance? Again, I don't know if you want to deal with that now or at the end. And then the other question so far is, at what age would a toddler start to question their gender?
I would say they would maybe question the idea of what gender has been placed on them. The toddler doesn't so much question their gender as knowing who they are. I've never questioned it. I knew it was fixed, but that happens at anywhere between 2 to 5. Generally speaking, kids start saying, arguing with their mom when they get verbal, and they'll say, you're calling me a boy, and I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. And for parents that are curious about that, there are 3 traits that a psychologist will look at to identify a child who's transgender, because it's common as all get out for little girls to play with fire trucks or little boys to hold a doll. And I've never understood the shame that we put on little kids, like little boys that hold a doll, right? They take it away and they say, well, that's a girl's toy, and they, here, play with a truck. I'm thinking, if you're trying to raise a heterosexual male and letting it play with a girl doll, isn't that pretty much perfectly natural? Or if you want that little boy to grow up and be a good father that nurtures his children, teaching him how to hold a baby, is that a bad thing? Because you watch guys and they hand a newborn baby to the father and they're like, well, I'm going to drop it, because they've never had any practice in holding a small child. So I think a little boy and holding a doll is not necessarily a bad thing. So yeah, even Target has started to not gender their toy aisle. It used to be, here's the blue aisle, here's the pink aisle, and now it's just the toy aisle. And so let the kids gravitate to whatever toy they want, let them explore. So it's very, very common for kids to experiment with gender, but there's 3 things that the psychologists look for, and that is, are they insistent, are they consistent, and are they persistent? And so it's kind of like, if your 3-year-old boy wants to wear a dress, what's it going to hurt? If he's still wanting to wear a dress when he's 11, it's like, okay, let's talk about that, because that's pretty persistent and that's pretty consistent. So if they identify that way, consistent, insistent, persistent, now you've probably got somebody who's transgender. But it's very, very common for kids to experiment. Talking about the way that the Christian church, I think somebody maybe rewrote their Bible on them, because I can't find the spots in the Bible that says, you know, you should dislike people because they're different from you. All the stuff that I found in the Christian Bible is Jesus says, you know, what you do to the least of us, you do to me, or that you should love your neighbor as you should love yourself. The things that are in that Bible are talking about kindness and giving to the poor and to the people that are, you know, Jesus hung with the lepers. He wasn't hanging with the, you know, the kings and the rich people there. So we're kind of the latter-day lepers. I was at a medical school, and I got done speaking, and there was a guy who's a third-year med student, and he said, I'm a Mormon. And he said, how can you justify changing the body that God gave you? And I said, that's a really good question. I said, let me kind of put it back on you. I said, if you had a child who was 10, who had an inflamed appendix, and unless you took it out, he was going to die, would you say to your son, well, God put that appendix there. If he wanted it out, he'd take it out? I don't think you would. I think you would take him down to the hospital and you'd remove that appendix, because it's not something he needs, and it's something that's causing a great deal of pain, and it's jeopardizing his life, and he'd have a happier life without it. Of course you would take that out. God put that appendix in there, but medical science says you can take it out. Or if he, in an accident, lost his arm below the elbow, would you say that's just the cards you're dealt, that's the way it's God's will? Or would you say, hey, they make marvelous prosthetics now that can allow you to play a ball, you know, throw a ball and play golf and do the things that other kids do, and yeah, we can fix that? Of course you would. So to me, all I did was fix a birth defect. I fixed something that I didn't need, that was causing me a great deal of pain, and was keeping me from living the life that I wanted to live. And I fixed that, and here we go. There's no difference there. So I'm more than happy to debate theology, God's will, whatever route you want to go. I don't see anything wrong, because I believe that our Creator wants us to live a happy, fulfilled life, and that for whatever reason, maybe he's got a really wild sense of humor, he made me transgender. And so, great, how are you going to deal with that? So I try and deal with it with grace. I try and help other people that are transgender like myself, and also people that are not, to understand us, because we're not a danger to society. We're not perverts. We're not predators, although we've been painted that way by our lieutenant governor, saying that women are in danger in a bathroom with us in there, and that's beyond ridiculous. I've been using women's bathrooms for close to 10 years, I guess, and I've never had an incident, ever. I've never seen anybody naked. They've never seen me naked. If you've never been in a women's room, every stall is walled off. It's not like we all go in there and look at each other. We go in there, we do our business, we come out, we wash our hands, we fix our hair, fix our makeup, and off we go. Sometimes we have a little chat. I was in a truck stop. I was coming back when my daughter lived in Phoenix. We were driving back through New Mexico, and I had to go to the bathroom. It was one of these big, giant truck stops that has like 20, 30 stalls in there. And so there was half a dozen women in there, and we just kind of made a little idle chit chat, and I went in the stall, and about maybe 15 seconds later, I guess it was some bleary-eyed trucker that stumbled into the women's room, and they just let him have it. It's, get the hell out of here. What are you doing? This is the women's room. And he's like, oh my God, I'm sorry. And he turned around and he went back into the right bathroom. And so they were kind of, you know, chit-chatting back and forth about this guy coming in the bathroom. So I get done, and I come out of the stall, and I'm washing my hands, and the woman next to me turns, she says, did you hear that man in here? And I said, yes, I did. She goes, what do you think about that man walking into a women's room? And I said, well, I think you handled it very well. I think you scared him half to death. I don't think you'll ever do it again. And so we just had a nice little conversation, and off we went. I'm not viewed as a threat in a women's room. I'm more likely to be assaulted in a women's room. I've got girl parts. I sure as heck don't belong in the other bathroom, and I'm not sure where those that don't think I belong in a women's room would suggest I go pee. That's the, the rule of thumb for us is use the bathroom at which you feel most safe. And for me, that's where I feel most safe. And I've never, ever had a problem in there. We're not predators. We're more likely to be prey. And bathroom rules, like the silly law that they were trying in Austin a few years ago, I was almost hoping it would pass because it would lead to rather comedic effect. On one end, it would be like if I was trying to obey the law. There was one that was written by Debbie Riddle down in the Woodlands in Houston. And Debbie Riddle's law had your sex on your chromosomes. Is anyone on the call ever had a chromosome test? I don't think so. I don't think any of y'all have. So if I said, do you know your chromosomes? You might guess, but you don't know. And with trans people, it's real common. There are not just XX and XY chromosomes. There's XXY. There's Klinefelter syndrome. There's another one called androgen insensitivity, which means the body is not sensitive to testosterone. It doesn't make it look male, even though the anatomy looks male. So there's a whole lot of different things that someone might have, but she based it on chromosomes. So if that law passed, I'm out with friends. And there was a companion bill that would have provided a bounty if you catch somebody of the wrong gender in a bathroom, which is crazy. $2,500. That was written by a guy named Richard Pena. And so if those laws were in place and I'm out with friends at a restaurant, let's say I drove. So I go in and I hate it, but I'm going to guess, because I'm a law-abiding person. My wife's a judge. I got to behave. So I am guessing that my chromosomes are XY. So I'm going to do the law-abiding thing, and I'm going to go into the men's room, even though there's nothing male about me, because I'm going to obey the law. So I go in there. A guy sees me and says, "You're in the wrong bathroom. I just made $2,500." And they call the police. So the police come out, and they ask for my ID, and it says female. And they say, "You're under arrest. You're being charged with a Class A misdemeanor." And they handcuff me, and they perp walk me out past my friends. And of course, since I drove, it's my car, and it's going to get impounded. So they take me down to jail, and they strip search me, and they find girl parts. So they say, "Okay, we got you dead to rights," and into the tank I go until I can get bailed out. So the next morning, somebody comes and posts my bail, and I come out into the morning sunlight, and I have to get my car out of impound. And I demand a chromosome test at county expense. So they do the chromosome test, and they find out that I was obeying the law, but I still have to pay a couple $100s to get my car out of impound. So I turned to one of the legislators and I said, "Is that every time I go to the bathroom in public, what I got to go through? Every time?" The other thing that they're forgetting is trans guys. Now, trans guys are people that are identified female at birth that now live their life as a guy. And testosterone does amazing things to the human body. It's a very, very powerful hormone. So it sprouts big bushy beards, the ability to put on muscle mass, and to look, your voice drops, you sound like a guy, you look like a guy, you are a guy. That's how you identify. So to force those guys into the women's room would create utter and complete chaos, because other than not being 5'10" or 11, generally, most trans guys are in the 5'6" to 5'9" range. Other than being a little bit shorter than average, they look like every other guy in the street. And so you have guys trooping in and out of the women's room. Well, that's going to create opportunities for real predators, because they could just go in under that guise. For the argument that they made to say, "Oh, well, predators are going to dress up as women to sneak into the women's room," it's like, well, A, they can do that now, and B, no, they won't. Because, a guy doing that would stand out. A bathroom is really not a great place if you're going to do something bad, because you can't tell who's coming in and out the door. And if someone screams, you're going to have 20 people in there, and you've got no other way to get out. So it's really not an ideal place. And the whole argument with, the bathroom bill and targeting trans people was just absolutely silly. And plus, if I ever saw somebody acting up in a women's room, I would throttle them. So you're safer with me in there than you would be without me. Let's talk about gender expression for a second. Gender expression is the way in which a person expresses their gender identity, typically through appearance, dress, and behavior. There was a legal case a number of years ago, Price Waterhouse v. Hopkins. It was a Supreme Court case that was based on gender expression because this woman, Ms. Hopkins, worked for Price Waterhouse, this real stodgy accounting firm. And she didn't dress in a way that was stereotypically feminine, and she was terminated for it. And she took her case to court and went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they said gender stereotypes cannot be enforced because that's considered discrimination under Title VII. And so that case was decided back in 1998. But just recently, we had a Supreme Court case. It was Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, which was an employment law case, which now says that gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation are covered under Title VII's Prohibition against employment discrimination. And that was a really landmark case for us because up to that point, in the state of Texas and federally, transgender people had no employment protection whatsoever. I mean, they didn't even have to make up a reason. They could just say, we don't want transgender people working here, so you're fired. And that's what happened to the plaintiff in the Bostock case, is she came out at work and was fired for it. I was fired from my radio job the day I came out, and it was totally legal at the time. There still are a lot of other ways that you can discriminate against transgender people, and we'll talk about those later. But gender identity is internal, gender expression is external. So I identify as female, and I'm wearing fairly typical female clothing, my hair, makeup, all kind of matches up with that today. That's my gender expression. Does that make sense? The term transition is a process of transitioning the body to match one's internal gender. And the idea is to stop the dysphoria. Dysphoria is that dissonance that trans people feel when you kind of look in the mirror and you see something that doesn't reflect back how you feel. There's no right way or wrong way. It's very personal. And as I said, asking about what someone is planning on doing, unless you're really, really close to them, is probably not a question you want to have asked of you. Especially surgery, medical procedures, things like that. Transition is really difficult for us. And the reason is, if you saw the issue with Caitlyn Jenner, you had Bruce sit down with Diane Sawyer on like a Friday night and come out, and then suddenly there's Caitlyn on the cover of Vanity Fair, and that's just not how it works. Like I mentioned, just getting the hair to not be in my face took 2 years. And it was painful, it was horrible. And I mean, even before an appointment, you have to grow your hair out for 5 days. So you have 5 days growth. And then afterwards, your face looks like a catcher's mitt. It's all red and swollen and everything, and it's terrible. And then a few weeks later, you have to do it again. But then the other surgeries and things have to heal. There are some that will do facial surgeries or hair transplants or boob jobs or whatever it is. And it's something that takes a great deal of time. So, and then the other thing is that taking cross-sex hormones, they're kind of slow motion miracles. They take time as well, but you'll have somebody, if like in my case, I was transitioning fairly late in life, here I am an adult, but I'm going through a second puberty. And that was really awkward and hilarious. So it's not an easy thing to go through. If you're watching someone do it, I would just say give them a little bit of room, a little bit of rope, because it's hard. Plus the socialization aspects, because when you're raising a little boy, you don't socialize a little boy in little girl things. And there's, they don't teach you as a little boy how to tie a knot on your hair and put it on the top of your head. So you have to learn that, or makeup things and how to shadow and accentuate the things that you want and others that you don't. And even just, sitting properly, and there's a million little things. So it just gets really awkward and funny. It's really good if you are any sort of organization, if you have a policy of some kind for transitioning employees, or in the case of students, having a personal transition plan, have correct names and pronouns on forms and documents, anything that you have that if you're filling out, even for church memberships, of having your name, and you might have preferred name, because that's not pejorative at all, because my dad was born James Thomas, but everybody called him Bill. And so if he was going to say, I wanted to join this organization, I want people to call me Bill, but this is my legal name. So having a preferred name, there's nothing wrong with that. Also, yeah, restroom, locker room accessibility, having policies help, because if there's ever a dispute, you can fall back on the policy. But if there's a dispute and you don't have a policy, it can start to get a little bit messy. Gender non-conforming. An example would be that kid there. Could go either way, right? That's someone who, again, might be non-binary, but it's also a term that we'll use as GNC, gender non-conforming, gender variance, gender diverse, behavior and gender expression that doesn't match typical masculine or feminine gender norms. Some additional useful terms are allies, which I hope is all of you. Intersex versus hermaphrodite. The term intersex is for people that are born with ambiguous genitalia. They used to do immediate surgery on these kids, but they found that they didn't always guess right. And so trying to fix something that was a bad guess can be painful, embarrassing, and sometimes impossible. So now they wait until the kids are older and they say, okay, how do you identify? And they find that that's fixed, and then they can kind of go and do something about that. But the term is intersex. Drag is performance. It's not an example of someone who's transgender. Transgender people, some will maybe perform drag, but it's not who we are. It would be a drag performance. But looking at someone who is doing drag and say, well, that's a transgender person. No, it's not. And the reason that's important is they were using that as an example in Houston to repeal an equal rights ordinance, is they were equating transgender people to RuPaul. And that's not who we are. That's not correct. Drag isn't a bad thing. It's just not who we are. The term drag is a acronym. It's dressed resembling a girl. Drag, right? The term two-spirit or third gender is used in some Native American populations, mostly in the Southwest. The Pueblo tribes will sometimes use the term two-spirit or third gender. It's not something I would apply to myself because I don't identify, I'm not a member of, I have no tribal affiliation. And so I would not take that term. We talked about pansexual, we talked about pronouns. They're really, really important. He, she, they are the more popular, more common. You'll see others, maybe. These mostly on the West Coast, she and here. If someone tells you their pronouns, again, please use them because getting misgendered does hurt each and every time. I want to share some of these from this sheet that Sherry was kind enough to provide. Get in the habit of interrupting people with a quick correction, because if somebody happens to misgender me, this happened, I had my gallbladder out. It was just this oddest little conversation, but I was in Baylor Grape Fund. And when I had my gallbladder out, for whatever reason, my liver numbers spiked. I mean, like there was a liver value called ferritin, and it's the iron in the blood. And so my ferritin level is supposed to be around 40 to 60. Mine was 4,000. And so they were really concerned. They thought there's a liver disease called hemochromatosis. And they said there's a possibility you could have hemochromatosis, and we want to bring this liver specialist in to talk to you about that and what, because it's not curable. And so I'm like, oh God. So they kept me in the hospital an extra few days, and they brought this liver specialist in, and she sat down and she's talking at me. She wasn't talking with me. She was talking at me. And my ID says female, my chart says female, my anatomy says female, my voice says I'm your uncle, which I hate. So as she's talking with me, she kept misgendering me. And my wife, Katie, would stop her and say, it's she, she's a girl. And she would stop for a second and then plow on, and she'd misgender me again. And Katie'd stop her and say, it's she, pay attention. And so she started getting really, really assertive with this doctor. And so this doctor was a liver specialist who knew 10 times more than I would ever in my lifetime about livers, but she was treating me as a liver, not as a human being. And so it was really, really irritating. So get in the habit of interrupting people, stop them. Don't let them get away with it. Don't let them just plow through in their ignorance. We would really greatly appreciate that, because it's fatiguing for us to have to continually validate who we are. One of the panels suggests for every time you get it wrong, do it right 3 times. And I think that's just more of like a mnemonic. I like to play golf. And one of the things that for the longest time, you'd get paired up with people you didn't know. And you would say, oh, you introduce yourself on the first tee. I'd say, hi, my name's Leslie. And the other person would say, hi, my name's Justin. Before they hit their first shot, I'd forgotten their name. But I played golf yesterday, and it was with two guys. It was a father and a son. And the son's name was Justin, and the father's name was Philip. And I still remember that because it was important to me to remember their names. And so all the way through the round, I could say, hey, nice shot, Justin. Boy, you really crushed that, Philip. Oh, sorry you missed that putt. So I could use their names, and it's more personal, it's more respectful. But you don't remember it if it's not important to you. So make it important to you. So whatever, if you have to say it 3 times, you have to memorize it, if you have to use an association, whatever works for you, but make sure you remember it because it's really important to the people that you're talking with. You can consider to meet with someone to practice, and you can kind of correct each other as you go along or think about ways to help remember that. And this is especially important for non-binary people because he and she are pretty easy to remember, but they is not something that comes naturally to a lot of people, again, unless you're thinking about things like grocery checkers that you don't identify the gender of. But they is important because if you call someone who's non-binary, who says, I'm really rejecting this femininity over here, and I'm adopting a lot of the masculinity, but not the kind of, the riding a tractor and getting tough, playing football, get in your face and fight at the drop of a hat. That's not me either, but I'm more male than female. And if you call them she, it's not who I am. But if you say he, there might be that association with them of that real masculinity that I want to divorce myself from. So they describes where they feel, and that makes them comfortable. And again, if we're talking to somebody and we care about them as a human being, we want them to feel comfortable. So whatever it takes to remember that. And again, there's been cases where there's resistance. It's kind of like for people that resist wearing a face mask. It helps protect others. It also helps protect you. And if a store is saying, this is really important, and to us, it's so important to protect our employees that we're asking everyone to wear one, well, go ahead and wear one, even if you don't want to. It's not a burden on you. I think that in the United States, we've gotten a little bit comfortable because people mistake wearing a face mask for oppression when it's just basically an inconvenience. But so many of us have never experienced either, so we don't know the difference. So if it's just an inconvenience, what's it to you? Using someone's proper name or proper pronoun makes a big difference to them. So it's not a burden to you. It's not about you. So using it correctly shouldn't be a big problem. And then don't make them alleviate your guilt. Express your love and learn from it. Because it's something that for us is kind of tiring because we hear it a lot. It's kind of like, flight attendant jokes. If you're telling them to a flight attendant, they're like, oh, brother, how many times do I have to hear that? So pronouns really do matter. A couple of other useful terms. This one's interesting. The term queer, it really has kind of an age delineator to it. If you're over the age of 40, it's a slur. If you're under the age of 40, it's a reclaimed term that's often used by the LGBTQ community as kind of an umbrella term, as like the queer population. But when my dad used it, it had some sting to it. And so I don't use it. Even if someone self-identifies as queer, I won't use that word because to me it's a slur and it was used to hurt. So I don't feel comfortable when I'm way over 40. But for those that are under 40 and they want to use it for themselves, I'm totally fine with that. That's great. So queer is kind of one of those cusp words that I wouldn't necessarily use if you're not part of the community. It's like, hey, you're queer, right? I wouldn't use it that way. Please don't. If someone self-identifies that way, that's perfectly fine. And then questioning is the other Q word that we have. And as someone who has questions about their sexual orientation or gender identity, there are some that when they're transgender, might be a person who's male to female. And so their first inclination is, well, I'm attracted to guys, so I must be gay. And they try that on and it doesn't really fit. And so they realize that they're transgender so they're female, still attracted to guys, and go, wow, that fits a lot better. So questioning does happen. The LGBTQ, or whichever it is, the Q represents queer or questioning. And then there are others on the whole alphabet soup is LGBTQQIAAP. And that's why sometimes you'll see LGBTQ plus, which kind of just says ... here's the rest, everybody's in there. But we've talked about all of these in here, the queer questioning, intersex, asexual, allies, and pansexual. So that's the language part of it. Everybody good on that? Or is there any questions or something that I can cover a little bit more for you?
Someone posed the question, what is the difference between, I think they meant non-binary and pansexual?
Non-binary is an identity. Pansexual is an attraction. So it's more of, if you're pansexual, it means you are attracted to anyone regardless of gender or identity. And if you're non-binary, it means you are not specifically male or female, but sort of an amalgam somewhere else. I was doing a tour for Mike Rollins, who used to be the mayor of Dallas. He was going through the resource center, and we were moving along, and he stopped dead in his tracks, and he turned to me and he goes, "Hey, what's this gender fluid non-binary thing? You know, what's that? What my kid was talking about, what's that even mean?" And I said, people tend to look at gender as a light switch. It's either on or it's off. It's either male or female. I said, look at it more like a dimmer switch. And there's different points on the continuum there. And he went, oh, okay. And off he went. So that's kind of a good way of looking at that. But pansexual would be identifying across all of those sexualities.
And then there's another question here. Where do, I guess the term used to be, cross-dressers, I don't know if that's fit into the gender identity spectrum?
It really doesn't, because most, the term is transvestite or crossdresser. And since women can pretty much wear anything, you really look at a woman that's wearing a flannel shirt and a pair of Levi's as a crossdresser. But if you have someone who identifies male who's wearing a dress, it's like, oh, okay, you're thinking, you know, Jerry Springer show or something. So people that are cross-dressers are pretty much 100% male identified. They're not transgender. They're not anything along the LGBT spectrum, but they enjoy wearing women's clothes for whatever reason. But it is not someone who's transgender because their gender remains male, and they live their life as guys, and they work as guys, and they have friends as guys, but they may occasionally, for whatever reason, wear women's clothes. So it's not really indicative of someone who's transgender. We good?
One more question, it just popped up. Does TV and movies and video games have a big impact on gender identity for young people?
I think they have a big impact on legislation, on shame, on shaping society, on worldviews, and they can have a detrimental, and they can also have a positive effect. And I'll give you some of the examples. I mentioned the Jerry Springer show. Transgender people were portrayed as cross-dressers or as something to be ridiculed or laughed at or mocked. If you saw the movie Ace Ventura, when that person found out that the woman that he was with was transgender, he freaked out. That's one of the things that we're battling right now, is a thing called the Transpanic Defense. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but the Transpanic Defense is where a guy typically has sexual relations with a transgender woman, finds out that she's transgender, and then murders her. And when he is put on trial for murder, says, I was so shocked and appalled at this person being transgender that I just lost control. Therefore, I wasn't in my right mind. Therefore, I'm not guilty of murder. And sadly, in places like Texas and Oklahoma and I think 19 other states, the Transpanic Defense is good as gold and is still in use today. And that's absolutely horribly wrong. So portraying transgender people as freaks, 2.5 Men had an episode about that with Charlie, who with a transgender woman. So those kind of things do us harm. But then we look at Orange is the New Black, Pose, Sense8. There's more shows that are coming out all the time, and there's been some pretty good movies as well that portray transgender people as we are. I think that really, really helps in a way that affirms identities for trans people that are watching, but it also helps educate the public to, okay, they're pretty much like all of us. They're just a different flavor of ice cream. You know, we're all in that same little ice cream case, but we're not all chocolate or vanilla. Some of us are, you know, these odd little flavors, but we're not that different. It's like if we were to sit down across a table and talk, and we talk about our families and talk about our upbringing and talk about our love for gardening, or I've got 3 border collies, and, you know, just all those different things. It's like, wow, we've got all these things in common. Gender is just one thing, and it shouldn't really get in the way of it, because I don't think it comes into play with any of your other friends. So I think once you get to know us, we're not in that freak category. But yeah, media being portrayed one way or another, it can help shape beliefs. And I would love to see more positive representation. One of the things I just talked with a documentary film producer, and I said, one of the things that we talk about with even TV stations is we would really like to see more stories on how we lived versus the ones on how we died. Because mostly when you see stories about transgender people on TVs, it's another vicious murder. And it's heartbreaking to see those, certainly for us. But I also, you know, I want to see the rest of America see that, you know, the transgender friends that I have, my wife is a judge and she's transgender, Dallas County judge. I've got another friend who's an air traffic controller. So you're putting your life in her hands, and she's not a kook. Another one flies jets. So again, you're putting your life in her hands. I know 3 that are very skilled surgeons that are transgender and are just do amazing work. Another that writes code for cities to do assessments, tax assessments. So you can throw rocks at her if you want. But yeah, there's a lot of very skilled and amazing transgender people out there doing different things. We're not a monolith by a far cry.
You know, I don't know if you've seen this movie, Leslie, but it just came out. It's called Disclosure, and it's a documentary. If you haven't seen it, if all of you haven't seen it, you should definitely see it. What was it, on Netflix? Or it's on Netflix, and it interviews a lot. It deals with a lot of these issues and interviews a lot of
representation of transgender.
Yeah, it's basically about media representation of LGBT and transgender people. It's a great movie. There's a couple more questions, but should we keep going and then?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. So someone asks, can you talk about the difference between personality and gender? I'm an INTJ, I don't know what that means, heterosexual female, and don't really fall into many of the gender stereotypes, but I'm not LGBTQ.
Yeah. I think we tend to get we get a little caught up in that on labels. I think the fewer the better, but I think if you are what we call a cisgender, because these are all Latin terms, Latin roots. Cis meanings on the same side of, so a cisgender person would mean that how they're identified is how they feel. Trans means on the other side of, or across from is the Latin root, and so that means across from what I was identified at birth. So those are kind of the Latin roots. So if somebody is cisgender and female and they like to play softball, they might be labeled a lesbian, but if they're attracted to guys, they're just a heterosexual. The word that they used to use is tomboy. I don't really like that so much, but I guess it applied to some. But it's okay. I think that the message that's overarching here is it's okay to like what you like. I'm a very girly girl, but I've got a Harley Davidson parked in the driveway because I like to ride. I don't ride all the time. I've got a nice cushy SUV that I ride in most of the time, but sometimes I feel like riding a motorcycle, and I put on leathers and a helmet and tuck my hair up, and I go out and go for a ride on my Harley. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I can be just as girly and have a Harley. I played golf yesterday with my wife. We played with a couple of guys, and we kept up with them, and we had a great time. So be who you are, like what you like. Don't worry about what society thinks about you. And that would be, don't let them hang labels on you. Just be who you are. Life's too short. Be happy. We good?
I think so. Oh, some people want to know, can they get a copy of your slide presentation after this?
As long as it's not used externally, we would need the proverbial written consent and all. But I could send it to you, and if you would like to disperse it out. But if it's being recorded, you can also show the recording. So however you want to put it together that way.
Yeah, I think some people just want like the hard copy of just the slide, so they can like review the terms and all of that. So
yeah, because there'll be a quiz later.
yeah, right. And if you do have some films and TV shows that you personally recommend, if you can send those to me, Leslie, I'll send them out because someone is requesting a list of recommended movies and TV shows.
Yeah, sure. And I've got a couple of books that I like as well that have been really good. But yeah, Boy Meets Girl, I think, is one of the better transgender movies that I've seen. It's really, really well done.
Yeah. And Pose, have you seen the TV show Pose yet?
I have.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Some of the words and things to avoid if you can. We see the term sexual preference. It's even written into law. And the reason we don't like sexual preference is it's not a menu. If you think, again, of yourself, do you prefer to be heterosexual, or could you be gay for a month or a year and then go back? I mean, do you open that menu up and say, oh, I feel like being gay today? Most people don't. So it's not a preference, it's an orientation. So it's, I think it minimizes what being gay or lesbian is. You're attracted to who you're attracted to, and that doesn't change. Try as hard as you want to. I mean, there's so many gay guys that have died because society makes it unacceptable for them to be attracted to other guys. And same with trans people. It's, my choice wasn't transitioning from male to female. My choice, if I had a choice, was living or not living. That was my choice. That was the choice I faced. It wasn't living this way. It was deciding whether or not to live at all. Lifestyle or alternative lifestyle. Again, if you're maybe a member of a boating club, a yacht club, something like that, that might be a lifestyle. But being gay or lesbian or being transgender is not a lifestyle. It's just my life. And again, it's not something that's changeable. And it's not something that you can just do on the side. It's just who you are. The term homosexual, it's not necessarily derogative. It's derogatory. It's just outmoded, really. We use it in the medical community, but we would use gay or lesbian in a public. Dead naming is within the trans community. Like I mentioned earlier, my given name was not Leslie, and wasn't even anywhere close to Leslie. But it's what we refer to as my dead name. It's not a name that I use anymore. It's been retired, it's gone. It's not on any paperwork that I have. It's not on my birth certificate anymore. It's nowhere. You can find it on the internet if you really want to, but why would you want to? Why would you care? It just leads to confusion at that point. And so dead naming somebody is usually kind of a cruel act and not something that we encourage. We talked about being transvestite. That, again, it doesn't describe who we are, so please avoid that. The term tranny is a violent term. It is fighting words to us. The reason is because that's a word of violence. There was a transgender woman in North Dallas that she was walking on the street. A guy in a red pickup truck pulled up, used that word, and shot her 6 times. So it's a word that if I hear it, I duck or I start swinging, one or the other, because I know nothing good's going to come if that word is said. It's usually the last word we hear before we get hit with a brick. So please don't ever use that word. I don't care how many times RuPaul says it's okay. RuPaul isn't transgender, and it's not okay. Hermaphrodite we talked about, and as that sheet has, please call out inappropriate language. I would say don't put yourself in harm's way for me. Don't get in a fight over me. But if you can use it as like a teachable moment, we really greatly would appreciate it, because that's how things change. If a word becomes socially unacceptable and it's stopped when it's said, that's when real change happens. But if we just kind of don't say anything, it's what we call tacit approval. Because if you don't call it out, it means, well, it's okay with you. And if it is, then yeah, that's not good. So know the terms, use them, and encourage others on proper use. We'll transition quickly here and touch on the coming out process. There's really 4 stages to it. You kind of have those feelings we talked about as coming at a very young age. And eventually you have to have that little moment with yourself to acknowledge that this is who I am. And then you might try coming out to friends and family. Friends are usually easier because, right, you can get new friends, but family is really tough, especially if you're younger. And the courage it takes for younger people to come out to their parents is amazing, because they often are thrown out on the street. There was a law that they're trying to put through, thank God it didn't pass, but it would have forced schools, if they found out that their child was gay, lesbian, transgender, they would be forced to tell the parents. And I think, you knew as a kid, as I did, if somebody said, here's a piece of news, say you found $500 that doesn't belong to you, but you found it. If you tell your parents, you knew what they were going to say. You didn't have to ask, right? You knew before you ever asked them how they were going to react to that, whether it was, hey, give me a cut and I'll, keep it quiet, or yeah, finders keepers, or you're going to take this down to the police department and you're going to make sure that we get this back to the rightful owner. But you knew whatever that reaction was, what it was going to be. So forcing the issue on kids would just create a whole lot of homeless kids, because there are kids that are gay or lesbian or transgender that know that if they come out to their parents that they're going to get the boot. So being able to do that, and it's oftentimes more difficult because they could be maybe paying your college tuition. And if they found out that you were gay or lesbian, they would just cut that off. And so you'd lose your education. So a lot of times kids are forced into the closet by the reaction of their family. Living openly includes workplace setting. That also, that's gotten a little bit better with that Bostock ruling, that we now have employment protection, but it still doesn't stop discrimination, because just like the Civil Rights Act didn't stop racial discrimination, it just made it illegal. Living openly can be difficult depending on the situation. If you're gay or lesbian, a lot of times you can kind of come out piecemeal to people, because you can't really just look at somebody and say, oh, you're gay or you're a lesbian or you're straight. So the important thing is to be able to bring your authentic self to school, work, church, wherever it is. Because if I have to change my behavior to be like you, I fit in. But if I get to be who I am, then I belong. And I think, in a congregation, you want to create a sense of belonging. That's what helps build the congregation and make it strong, and, interweave that basket and make it able to hold more. Is if I can belong, then I feel loved and I feel welcome, and I can let my guard down and I can relax. But if I feel like I have to be like everyone else in order to fit in, that's not as good. So sometimes it is often easier to stay in the closet with certain people. That all gets tossed into the wind with transgender people, because, well, if I show up at a family reunion and family members that haven't seen me in a long time, they say, who are you? And I say, well, I'm Bill and Mary's son. They, what? That's not who I remember. So there's no staying in the closet if you're transgender. Same thing with at work. If they hired me as a guy and I've been working there for 4 years as a guy, and then I show up looking like this, I've got some explaining to do. So for transgender people, if you're out, you're out. You just kind of have to take that plunge, and it's, like I said, it's awkward and it's difficult and it's time consuming and it's expensive, but ultimately it's transforming and life-saving. For trans people, again, if you come out as gay or lesbian, you don't have to change your driver's license, right? It stays the same. You just are who you are. But for us, we got to change the name, change the picture on driver's license, Social Security, because if Social Security has me listed as male and I go on Medicare and have prostate problems, they're going to go, they're going to reject that claim. And now I've got to go through a bunch of hoops to prove that I'm female, but was identified male at birth. Therefore, I still have an intact prostate, even though I look like a girl, and it's just not a conversation you want to have. So you got to get that changed over. School transcript, bank accounts, credit cards, passports, car title, everything. And then there's Google that can out you at the drop of a hat. So it's quite the process. Someone should come out to you. I would say take it as a compliment that you're trusted. Be a good listener, support them, but remember it's not your story to tell, even though sometimes it can be a juicy piece of gossip. We'll talk about cultural competency here real quick. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Be aware of your own cultural views. Now more than ever, because there's so much influence being exerted. But you think about, if I were to ask you what you believe, if you were to, I don't even know that you could, but you would need to strip away all the things that's been put into your head externally to get to what you believe. Because as a kid growing up, your parents put ideals and goals and the right and wrong and all the sense of morality of whatever theirs is into you. And then you see how your friends live, and then you watch TV and you listen to the radio and you go to church and you interact with employers and you're on social media and all these other things that are putting commercial ideas and their opinions and all this stuff into your head. Take all that out. What do you believe? What's right for you? So be aware of your own cultural views. There's things that are really super insidious. When I was growing up, I watched some of the cowboy westerns. And if you look back to Roy Rogers, he wore a white hat. Bad guys did what? They wore a black hat. So white's good, black's bad. On the right side of the law, criminals, white, black. I saw something just recently. It was from the Centers for Disease Control. They were showing how a pandemic progresses. This was back in March or April when this COVID thing was just getting going. So what it showed was a box, and it was full of white dots, and it introduced a couple of black dots. And the black dots were to denote someone with COVID, and it showed how fast this infection would spread as it would turn the white dots black going through this whole box. But again, they used white to denote healthy, black to denote sick. And so it's just gently and methodically and consistently put in your head that white's good, law-abiding, safe, healthy, all these things. Black is bad. And it's just this, when we talk about systemic racism, that's how it can get in there, and we need to reject that and then not make those assumptions or connections. And when we design something like that, maybe we can flip it around the other way or make it blue and green or something along those lines. So yeah, have the skill to effectively work with people across different cultures and understanding. And as a Jewish congregation, you have your own share of oppression that goes back thousands of years of being singled out. So I would think there would be a special kind of compassion for others that are dealing with similar challenges and societal challenges. Awareness and acknowledgement of cultural differences. I think that's important because sometimes people will say to someone who's African American, they'll say, well, I don't see color. Well, then you're erasing their identity as an African American. So I think we can see it, but not let it make a difference in our interactions and who we are. And as Martin Luther King said, we'll judge them by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, but not to make them invisible. Culture is a total way of life among a group of people, shared values, beliefs, ideas, and learned patterns and behavior. It can be art and history and literature and attitudes and language and technology. But culture influences how a person behaves, what they believe, and what they actually know. Cultural identities, people belong to, identify several different cultures and subcultures, and that's what makes us who we are. Because there's some that might be politically right, but be socially left, that have dogs that like to cook and are not very active, versus a friend of theirs that shares a lot of those, but might be more active and likes cats. And so we all just kind of blend together and make up these stews of who we are. But those combinations can impact and even conflict with one another. Although I've never met this person, it could be an NRA member and a PETA member, who knows? So cultural identities, perceptions, and experiences are based on a whole lot of things and more. These are just a few. And like I was saying at the front of this, is if we wanted to talk about culture and cultural agility, we could do a 2-hour seminar just on that. But it's interesting to note that perceptions and biases exist within and across sub-communities, and we're often challenged in a lot of ways. I don't know if you've heard the term intersectionality. Is that a new term? The origin of intersectionality came from a lawsuit. It was an employment lawsuit. And it was filed by a Black female who was charging her employer with not promoting Black female employees within this community, within the business. And so she took them to court on that. And the judge said, you can't sue on two different bases. You can only sue on one at a time. So she had to sue based on they don't promote Black people and they don't promote women. But they can't sue based on you not promoting Black females. So she was forced to file two cases. Well, the company could show that they have promoted Black men. So that case was lost. They can also show that they promoted women, and that case was lost. They couldn't show that they promoted a single Black female, but she couldn't sue based on that intersectionality of oppression. And so that's something that we need to be aware of, that sometimes those things cross. What area of your life do you feel that you deal with the least amount of prejudice and discrimination? Again, it's just a rhetorical question because it's not something a lot of us think about from time to time because we tend to be very privileged. What area of your life do you feel like you deal with the most amount of prejudice and discrimination? Is it because of your religion? Is it because of your socioeconomic status? But it's just something to think about. For me, before I transitioned, being a white male, I worked in the radio and TV business. I made a lot of money. I was healthy. I had every door open to me that could possibly be open. There was no laws against me. There was nothing that stood in my way. People wanted me to eat in their restaurants and not take my money and go to their ski resorts and see their movies. And I could pretty much do whatever I wanted and do it for free and get paid a lot of money to do it. But I wasn't happy. That's not what made me happy. But losing so many things and encountering life as a female is very different than it was walking through life as a guy. Like even just walking to my car in a parking garage. If I'm by myself, my head's on a swivel, I've got my keys in my hand, I've got my purse next to me, I'm very, very aware. Where before it was just, whistle and zippity doo-dah and walk to my car and no problem and on the way I go. So it's just even subtle little things, but there's a lot of them. Power is the ability to achieve your aims and further the interests you hold, even if opposed by others, the ability to impose your will, different relationships like parents, boss, government, teachers, politicians, judges. Power can equate to privilege. And this is what I was talking about, is prior to transition, I had pretty much all of those things. And giving up being male, giving up being heterosexual according to society, giving up being cisgender, being a religious minority, and being rich, that one hurt as well. And I've never been right-handed in my life. So I pretty much gave up all that privilege to be me. And it was a lot to give up. I'm making 20% of what I used to make in radio, but I'm a lot happier because of it. Some of the issues, those with privilege are often unaware that they're privileged. That can be damaging and really frustrating for those without it. And when they deny that privilege exists, they also rarely understand the full impact on those who do not have it. And privilege can change across time, conditions, and situations, as I illustrated with my transition. Inequalities and discrimination occur when power and privilege are not equally shared by all members of society. I'll hit these real quick. Some of the phobias and isms that you'll see, and these can end up in things like discrimination, to violence and murder and legislation. For instance, and I'll hit these real quick because I know we're just about out of time, but prior to the Bostock ruling, transgender people had no employment protection both in the state of Texas and in the federal government of the United States. No employment protection at all. Still, we can be evicted from our apartments for being transgender and being transgender only. We can't join the military. Doctors can refuse health care to us. We can actually be refused health care legally in the state of Texas. And then we can also be denied access to homeless shelters. And there's about 73,000 of us across the South that are in voter ID states, so we can't vote because our ID doesn't look like us, because we may not have access to money to change our name and gender marker in those states. So there's an awful lot of oppression that's stacked on us. So it's not like we're asking for extra rights, we're just asking for basic human rights. So I'll wrap with this for now. There are some other slides, but I know we're pretty much out of time, and if there's other questions, I would love to address those.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, I hope that it's okay if we've gone a few minutes over time,
Sure.
if we can just ask a few of these questions. First of all, and just on a personal note, my son Preston, who we've been trying to get to move here, at least during COVID, when he was in New York, he said, I can't do that because I'm afraid a doctor wouldn't treat me if I got it. And that's true. I mean, it's a thing. And, you know, again, until it's really close to home, you don't realize how
No.
you are. So one of the questions is, my guess, so this person is asking you, my guess is that you, Leslie, would support transitioning prior to puberty. Would that be something that you would support?
Yeah, and that's something that's really important to address is, yeah, I would love to have been able to, because what they do, and there's a lot of misunderstandings, and they were used as political pawns. There is a 7-year-old transgender girl in Capel who's the pawn in a really bitter divorce. The father is not affirming at all. So when she's over at his house, the father makes her dress as a guy all the time. And at the mother's house, the mother is a pediatrician and is affirming, and it allows the child to identify as a girl and grow her hair longer. But then she goes back to the father and he has her hair forcefully cut, where they're not forcing the brothers to be cut. And so it's just absolutely tragic. So then enter our Texas state leaders who have gotten in the middle of this, our attorney general and our lieutenant general, or lieutenant governor, who are trying to now put together a law, and they're saying that they're referring to allowing the 7-year-old to transition as genital mutilation. And they're talking about the medical things that you would do to someone. There is no medical work being done on any 7-year-old anywhere for being transgender. Transition to a 7-year-old means a change in name, maybe a change in pronouns, hairstyle, and clothing. That's it. That is the sum total of transition for a 7-year-old. They would introduce what's called a puberty blocker. There's 2 drugs that they'll use. One is called Superlin and one is called Lupron. One's an injectable and the other's a pellet that goes underneath the skin and just stays there for, I think, 6 months to a year, and then it can be replaced. And all it does is hit the pause button on puberty. And if at any point they want to remove it, then the child would undergo a spontaneous puberty of whatever its biological birth is, and no harm done. There's not cross-sex hormones that are given to small children. The puberty blockers are introduced. There's 5 stages of puberty, and they're referred to as a Tanner scale. So at Tanner stage 2, they would introduce puberty blockers, which would stop puberty at that point. That's before the voice changes. That's before the growth plates hit. That's for a lot of the changes that give you a very identifiable male or female, because prior to puberty hitting, the kids are fairly indistinguishable from one another, absent hair and that kind of stuff. So between Tanner stage 2 and Tanner stage 5, that might be 15, 16 years old. And so if the child still identifies as transgender, is happy with the puberty blocking, both parents are on board, the doctor's on board, the psychologist is on board, and the kid's committed, then they can introduce cross-sex hormones, and only then will you start to see those secondary sex characteristics like breast growth or the voice changing or things like that would happen in a typical puberty. Because once they happen, they're irreversible. I can't change my voice. I can't change the size of my hands or my height or the width of my shoulders or the fact that I don't have any hips. I can't change those things now. They're fixed. I cried through most of my puberty. I hated it. My body was doing everything I didn't want it to do. So, but there wasn't, back in like 1969, there wasn't a whole lot going on as far as puberty blockers. Those are a fairly recent thing, and they're just an absolute godsend. So yeah, if you can do it before puberty hits, if the parents are affirming, if the kid is insistent, consistent, persistent, the doctors agree, the psychologists agree, both parents are on board, then absolutely, yeah, to live a happier, healthier life. Because I've seen some of these kids that are in their 20s now, and they're absolutely gorgeous. They're happy, they fit right in, they don't have any explaining to do. They're just who they are, and it's absolutely beautiful. And that's yeah, I would support that.
Someone wants to know where and when the term coming out, you know, what was the history of that term?
Because people that were gay or lesbian were referred to as being in the closet. And so it's kind of coming out of the closet. So hiding who you are is being in the closet. And I don't know specifically when it was coined. I would guess it would be somewhere around 1978 with Harvey Milk, because he was battling. I lived in California at the time, and California is different from Texas in that our legislature does certain things as far as passing laws, but the populace of California can unpass those laws through the initiative process or referendums. So we can unpass through referendums, we can create laws through initiatives. And so there was an initiative that was put forth by one of our legislators, a guy named Briggs. It was Proposition 6 on the ballot back in 1978. And what that would have done is fire every gay or lesbian teacher or teacher's assistant or anyone that worked with kids in the state of California, because they were afraid that they were going to recruit them into being gay, which is the most ridiculous thing in the world, because I don't think there's any amount of counseling that I could give to any of you to make you believe that you're transgender or that you're gay or lesbian. It just doesn't work that way. So he was trying to fire every gay or lesbian teacher in the state of California. And Harvey Milk, who was at the time kind of a rabble rouser, but he was running for supervisor in San Francisco, which is like on our commissioner's court there. And he was giving a speech saying, you have to come out. You have to come out of your closets. You have to be visible. You have to show people who you are, because we're being branded as predators. We're being branded as these fiends that shouldn't be around kids. So you have to come out and be visible. And I think that's probably, as far as I can tell, kind of what that origin would be. But it's coming out of the closet, and it's a bad place to be, because you don't want to have to, keep part of your life segmented off. And it's one of the things that was difficult with my kids, because here I was their dad, and they believed, certain things about me. And when they found out that I'd been keeping a big part of myself from them for a long time, that was kind of a conversation we had to have.
One last question, this one's for me, and it involves our congregation. I'd like to know, or I'm sure we all, I hope I don't just speak for myself, I think, what concrete steps should we be taking to make our space a safe one for all LGBTQ plus people who come in?
There's lots. I mean, there's some subtle ways. One of the things that was really interesting is during Pride Month, the city of Dallas has been flying a pride flag for a number of years, but they've been flying it inside City Hall. This year they flew it outside City Hall. So that said, we kind of came out of that closet. It's like, we don't want to be the little secret. It's like, okay, we'll hang one for you, but it's going to be in here. They put it outside where it's loud and proud. Having, little symbols, either whether it's a pride flag or a rainbow or things like that. We do trainings for DISD, their teachers and counselors. It's called Out for Safe Schools. So once they undergo the training for Out for Safe Schools, they get a lanyard that's a rainbow lanyard and an ID that says Out for Safe Schools. And any kid that sees someone wearing one of those lanyards knows that's a safe person to go talk to, because they've had training. So they can come out to them, or they can talk about being bullied or harassed, and they know that they're going to have a positive outcome because this person has been trained. So conducting trainings like this, having little rainbow pins, if you have name badges that say, hello, my name is, put pronouns on there. On your emails, have the pronouns on your signatures. And for people that think, why should I put pronouns on there? You know, nobody's ever misgendered me. It's like, well, yay, good for you, because it really sucks. I get misgendered and it hurts and it could put me in danger. But if I see somebody with, like at a convention that says, you know, my name is, you know, Jim and my pronouns are he, him, I know that Jim's a safe person to talk to, that he's a little bit more woke. And so I'm much more likely to engage him in a conversation. So there's things like that. If you see stuff in Arlington, write a letter to the newspaper and say, this needs to stop, or this needs to get fixed. If you see hate speech, stop it. You can write letters to your legislators. There's a whole lot of things that you can do, but there's a lot that are just little subtle things that say you're welcome here.
Anyone, is this the end of, if this is the end of the slideshow, if you can unshare your screen so we can see, anyone can see if there's anyone else before we go that has a question or a comment. Well, one person's writing in the chat, this is to me has been without a doubt the most brilliant, informative, personal, revealing, educational discussion I have ever had the fortune to hear. Thanks for blessing us all, Leslie. Truly an amazing learning moment and opportunity to understand something that was previously not understandable. So,
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else? And if you have a question, okay, Fran, if you could unmute yourself, and Shirley after Fran, if you can unmute yourself, we'll if that's it, then we'll just close with those two questions.
Okay, I just had a question about, I think you were talking about the various terminology used, and I had a question about, once when I was younger, I dated a guy and he did not say that he was bisexual to me. Mm-hmm. And I was angry because I felt like he owed me that, to tell me, okay, I didn't know he was bisexual, that he had been with men. Yeah. Okay, that I felt uncomfortable, okay, because he had never shared that with me. That, is there some discussion about when someone, say a younger, like if I met someone who was younger and was dating someone and had some advice, and you get angry if people don't sometimes open up to you about these things. And that was just something that I went through then. I mean, this has been so informative to me. You have opened my brain up to so many things, and I'm very appreciative, thinking that I am so open and accepting, but I still enjoyed it. What is your feeling on those sorts of issues? Yeah, dating when revealing things about yourself.
Yeah, that's a nightmare. It's utterly terrifying. If you can imagine our heartbeat going a million miles an hour. I understand your anger, because you want to feel that the person that you're with is being open, that what they're saying to you is, you know, the full, complete, this is who I am. I hid a segment of myself from my ex-wife for a long, 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 long time. But my fear was that if I ever told her, that she'd be gone. When I told her, she was gone. So I accurately predicted that. But also the other part, the reason I didn't come out is I kind of did a trial run back in 1991. My children were 12 and 6. And I was going to a Halloween party, and I dressed in drag, but not as like funny, you know, ridiculous drag. I was trying to see if I could pull it off. And so when I came out, my daughters were absolutely mortified. They were it was traumatized of seeing their dad looking like that. And that put me back in the closet for another 20 years, because I didn't want to have them teased at school or ridiculed because of who and what I was. I didn't want to lose my job as sole breadwinner, because I was the only one that worked. I made great money, but my ex didn't work. And so that would have I mean, we'd have lost our house if I'd have lost my job, and I probably would have. So I waited until they were out of the house and married, and that the risk was at its lowest. And my ex and I were going round and round, and she kind of forced the issue one day, and I came out, and she pretty much drove to California and never came back. So disclosure is really, really hard. I think it's important if you're going to have a serious relationship, especially in your case, if you have in the world of HIV, if you need to know if the guy you're with is sleeping with other guys. That's, I mean, and I would say before I would sleep with a guy, I want to have an AIDS test. I want to make sure that, you know, you're healthy. That's one of the best ways to make sure that's there. So that it's a health and a life issue, and that's really, really important. For transgender people, it's not a health risk. What's terrifying for transgender people, and I don't have the answer, I wish I did, but I don't know if the name Isla Nettles makes, does that ring a bell? Isla Nettles is a trans girl in New York. And a number of years ago, you can look up on the internet, but she was walking home at night with a friend. And there was 3 guys that were sitting on a wall, and they were catcalling Isla Nettles, or one of the guys was. And so his buddy turned to him and said, "That's a dude." And the guy jumped down off the wall, and he beat Isla Nettles to death. And the reason he killed Isla Nettles is because his sexuality was threatened, is because he found this person attractive. The real tragedy of that is that if a guy is attracted to a trans woman, he's heterosexual, because we're girls. We look like girls, we are girls. We're girls in every way. And so if you're attracted to us, you're still heterosexual. We don't threaten or change anything. But too often we're murdered when people find out who we are. And that's terrifying. But on the flip side of that, it's like if I'm dating, and I've fortunately not had to be in that. So I've been married now and been in a relationship for 7 years. But there are trans people that I know that wrestle with the question of, if I'm online, if you state online that you're transgender, what you get is what we call chasers. And chasers are people, guys, who fetishize us. And they're interested mostly in transgender people that haven't had surgery. And so they're looking for a trans girl with a little something extra. And it's a fetish, and it's weird, and it's not something that we want to be part of. So we tend not to put a trans identity on a dating site. So if we go out with somebody, do you tell them on the first date, and then they have no time invested? Somebody that maybe you could have a really good relationship with bolts before he gets to know you, based on one little attribute of who we are. Because my gender to me is just that much. It's not, there's so much more to me than that. So do you wait until the second or third date or the fourth date? And then you've lied to them and you've betrayed them because you held this back and didn't tell them, and now they're really mad at you? Or do you wait until it gets intimate and then they murder you? So I don't know what the right answer is, because dating for us is an absolute nightmare, and it's terrifying. So yeah, I'm very sympathetic, and I think for me, the bisexual issue is, yes, they need to disclose that, because in the world of HIV, that's a very real threat. On the trans issue, that's a whole other difference, because guys tend to look at, if they're attracted to someone who's transgender, that threatens their sexual orientation. That maybe means that they're gay, and they're not. Not that there's anything wrong with being gay, but it's just some people feel really threatened by that. But it doesn't change that. If you're attracted to me as a girl, then you're hetero. Hope that makes sense.
Thanks. Okay, last question. I think Shirley, you had a question, so
I do not have a question, but I just want to thank Leslie for all this beautiful, good information that you gave all of us. And since I live in California, I see the things that is no good in Texas, and now I see how much more freedom is on this side. And I pray for the day that everywhere is perfect. And thank you for everything you said and everything you taught us.
Of course.
Have a great, safe day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Thank you so much, Leslie, for really digging deep with us, for sharing your story, for really helping us to connect on both general, educational, and a personal level. We are very appreciative. Again, this recording was we recorded this, so if you want a copy of it, I'm sure I'll be able to figure out how to get that to you. And then the slideshow will also, I guess, be able to make available to you.
I can send that to you, yeah.
So again, once again, from Congregation Beth Shalom, Toda Rabah, thank you very, very much. And have a wonderful
Very much my pleasure.
afternoon,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Sherry, there's a really good question in the chat room, though.
Oh, there's more.
What you got?
Yeah, but wait, there's more.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, how do you address discrimination and privilege with someone that is not open to listening, from family or a random stranger? Personally, I'll let you let Leslie know. Personally, I think there's some people you just can't reach, and you just gotta, make your peace with that. But Leslie, I'll let you answer. Have a final word.
Yeah, that's never rustle in the mud with a pig, because the pig's going to enjoy it. You can't fix willful ignorance. If you lay out the facts for somebody and they ignore the facts, that's really about all you can do. Then that's on them. There's only so much time you can spend trying to, change someone's mind. Their mind has to be open before you can change it. And sometimes maybe this will happen over time. But there's people that I'm resigned to that they're just going to hate me anyway. But my life is too important to me to spend my time with trolls or people that hate me. I want to live my life in a place of gratitude and love, and to try and help other people along the way. And I think that it just makes me so sad. My brother is an evangelical Christian, and he feels like that by speaking my name out loud, it will somehow offend God. And I'm thinking, well, you serve a pretty weird God, because he sounds, you make him sound like a petulant little child, when I think he's magnificent and great, and he loves us all, and he wants us to be happy. So if it's a mind that can't be changed through facts or through compassion, then move on. Just, I would say, try and decide who you want in your life.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thanks again, everybody.
Bye.
If you have any other questions, you can forward that. You can write me, and I can
Yeah,
always Leslie. Yeah.
Yep. I'll be here for the answer. All right.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Thanks. Stop.
Phone call.
Wait a minute. How do I get back on? How do I get back on? Okay. Leslie, are you still there?
I'm still there.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay. All right, good. I don't know who this person is. So, let me just turn the record.